A collapse does not have to be loud to be real. We picture collapse as something sudden, a crash, a flood, a single catastrophic day that changes everything, because that is the kind of disaster our minds are built to notice. But the most dangerous collapse of all is the one that moves too slowly to see. The one that unfolds not in a day or a season, but across decades. So gradually that in any given year it looks like nothing at all, just a slightly worse version of the year before. And that is exactly the kind of collapse now underway across the most productive agricultural regions in America, the places that grow the food for a nation and much of the world. It is happening right now, not as a sudden catastrophe that forces itself onto the news, but as a slow, grinding failure of the very foundations that make these regions productive. The water is draining. The soil is thinning. The climate is shifting out from under the crops. The people who know how to farm are aging out with no one behind them. And each of these is moving slowly enough, quietly enough, that in any single season it can be dismissed as an ordinary problem, a rough year, a local difficulty. Add them all up, extend them across decades, and they are not ordinary problems. They are the slow-motion collapse of the American food system's core, playing out in real time, in plain sight, and almost entirely unremarked. Here is the terrible genius of a slow-motion collapse. Because it never produces a single dramatic moment, it never triggers the alarm. There is no day the sirens go off. Every year looks survivable because it is only slightly worse than the last, and the mind adjusts, quietly resetting what counts as normal until the accumulated change is enormous and no one ever felt the jump. A society will mobilize overnight against a sudden threat and sleep for 50 years through a slow one that is far more dangerous. That is not a flaw in the crisis. From the crisis's point of view, it is a superpower. The slowness is precisely what allows it to win. So let me show you the collapse that is hiding in plain sight across the regions that feed you, and why its slowness is not a reason for comfort, but the very thing that makes it so hard to stop. Picture a wall in a farm shop, the kind of place where a family keeps its records. Tacked up there, going back 40 years, are the well logs, the drilling records for the water that made this farm possible. And if you read them from oldest to newest, top to bottom, you are reading the collapse itself, written in a quiet column of numbers. The first well, decades ago, struck good water at 80 feet. The next one, years later, had to go to 140. The one after that, 260. The most recent, over 400 feet down, and the water it pulls is not as clean as it used to be. Each of those numbers, on the day it was written, felt like a normal cost of doing business, a slightly deeper well, a slightly bigger pump. Nothing to panic over. But stand back and read the whole wall at once, and it is not a list of ordinary expenses. It is a graph of a resource disappearing, a straight line heading for a floor. 4 decades of slow-motion collapse that no single year ever announced. The farmer who reads that wall every morning knows exactly what it says. He has just never had a single day dramatic enough to make him say it out loud. Let me start by showing you what a slow-motion collapse actually looks like on the ground, because it does not look like a disaster at all. Drive through one of America's great farming regions at the height of the growing season, and you will see abundance. Fields stretching to the horizon, green and heavy with crops, trucks on the highways, irrigation running. It looks, for all the world, like the picture of a food system working exactly as it should. And that is the trap, because the collapse is not visible in a snapshot. It is only visible in the trend, in the comparison across years that no casual observer ever makes. The well on that farm is a little deeper than it was a decade ago and was drilled deeper than the one before it. The land sits a few inches lower than it did, sinking so slowly no one notices. There are a few more fallow fields than there used to be, a few more for sale signs, a few more orchards pulled out. The farmer is a little older, and his kids are a little more certain they are not coming back. Every one of these signals is small. Every one of them is easy to explain away in isolation. But laid end to end across 20 or 30 years, they trace the outline of something enormous and slow and irreversible, a collapse you cannot photograph because it is happening at the speed of a glacier, and like a glacier, it is grinding down everything in its path. To understand why we cannot see it, you have to understand something about the human mind, because our blindness to this is not stupidity. It is built in. Human beings are exquisitely tuned to respond to sudden change and almost completely blind to gradual change. A threat that arrives all at once, a fire, a flood, an attack, seizes our full attention and mobilizes our response. But a threat that arrives slowly, in increments too small to notice, from one day to the next, slips right past our alarm system. Psychologists talk about shifting baselines, the way each generation, and even each year, quietly accepts the current degraded state as the normal one, forgetting how much better it used to be. The farmer whose well is now 400 feet deep does not feel alarm, because last year it was 380, and that felt normal, because the year before it was 360. There is a famous, probably apocryphal image of a frog that will leap out of hot water but sit still and boil if the water is heated slowly enough, and whether or not it is true of frogs, it is devastatingly true of people and the systems they build. We do not respond to the slow boil. We adjust to it, again and again, until we have adjusted our way into catastrophe. This is why a slow-motion agricultural collapse can be one of the largest threats a country faces, and simultaneously one of the least discussed. It is not that the information is hidden, it is that the pace is wrong for the alarm to ever ring. You can watch this shifting baseline work across the generations of a single farm family. The grandfather remembers when the creek ran year-round, and the water was 15 feet down, and the topsoil was black and deep, and to him, that was normal. The father grew up with the creek running only in spring, and the water at 80 feet, and the soil already thinner, and to him, that was normal. Because it was what he knew. The son farms it now, with the creek long dry and the water 400 feet down, and the soil pale and tired, and to him, this is normal, because it is the only version he has ever seen. Each generation inherits a degraded version of the land and calibrates its sense of normal to that, so that the enormous decline across 3 generations is never felt as a decline by anyone, only as the ordinary condition of things. No single person in that line ever experiences a crisis. Each just quietly accepts a slightly poorer world than the one before and calls it the way things are. This is how a catastrophe can unfold completely across a century, while every individual who lives through it sincerely believes they are living in normal times. The baseline moves, silently, generation by generation, and the memory of what was lost moves with it, until there is no one left who remembers the land any other way, and the loss becomes invisible, not because it did not happen, but because everyone who could have compared is gone. Now let me show you where this is happening, because it is concentrated in exactly the places we can least afford to lose. America's food does not come evenly from everywhere. It comes, overwhelmingly, from a handful of extraordinarily productive regions, and that concentration is part of what makes the slow collapse so dangerous. There is California's Central Valley, a strip of land that grows a huge share of the nation's fruits, vegetables, and nuts. The produce section of the entire country condensed into one sinking valley. There is the vast belt of the high plains, sitting over the great Ogallala aquifer, that grows the grain and raises and feeds the cattle behind much of the nation's bread and beef. There is the Mississippi Delta, growing rice and soybeans and cotton on the water of an aquifer few people have ever heard of. There are the irrigated basins of the arid West and the specialized valleys that grow particular crops found almost nowhere else. These regions are not interchangeable. Their soil, their climate, their accumulated infrastructure and knowledge make them uniquely productive, which means that when they decline, the production cannot simply move somewhere else. And every one of them is running on the same slowly failing foundations, drawing down water that will not refill, farming soil that is thinning under a climate that is shifting, worked by a generation that is aging out. The collapse is not scattered thinly across the country where it might be absorbed. It is concentrated in the exact places the country cannot do without. The first foundation failing beneath these regions is the water, and it is failing in slow motion by definition. The great productive regions run on irrigation, and that irrigation draws on rivers and aquifers that are being drawn down far faster than they refill. But an aquifer does not empty in a day. It drops by a foot or two a year, invisibly, underground, for decades, which is the perfect pace to escape notice. The Ogallala under the high plains has been declining for generations, its water measured now in the years of pumping that remain rather than the centuries it took to fill. The aquifers under the Central Valley have been so overdrawn that the land above them is sinking. The rivers of the West, above all the Colorado, have been promised to more users than they can supply and have been dropping toward crisis. None of this happened suddenly. All of it happened at the speed of a slow-motion collapse, a little more gone each year. Each year explained away as drought or a dry cycle, until the cumulative loss became the structural, permanent shortage it is today. Water is the clearest example of the whole pattern, a foundation being removed so gradually that the removal never sets off the alarm, even though everyone can see, if they bother to compare the decades, exactly where the line is heading. The second foundation failing is the soil itself, and it is disappearing even more quietly than the water. Beneath every one of these productive regions is soil, the thin living layer that actually grows the food, and it is being lost and degraded at a pace almost no one perceives. Topsoil erodes away under intensive farming faster than nature can rebuild it, blown off by wind and washed off by rain, so slowly in any given storm that no one registers the loss, yet steadily enough that over decades a region can lose a significant fraction of the fertile layer that took thousands of years to form. The soil that remains is often being depleted of its organic matter and its living biology, kept productive only by ever-increasing inputs of fertilizer that mask the underlying decline. In irrigated regions, salt slowly accumulates in the soil with every cycle of watering and evaporation, poisoning the ground by degrees. This is collapse at its most invisible, because soil loss makes no sound and shows no drama. A field that has lost half its topsoil over 50 years looks, on any given day, almost exactly like it did the day before. But the fertility that defined these regions is being spent down, quietly, and unlike a bad year, lost topsoil does not come back on any human timescale. The ground itself, the literal foundation, is thinning under the crops, and the slowness of it is the only reason it is tolerated. The third foundation failing is the climate the crops depend on, and it is shifting the ground rules underneath everything else. Every crop in every region is adapted to a particular climate, a range of temperatures, a pattern of rainfall, a rhythm of seasons that it evolved and was bred to fit. And that climate is slowly moving. Growing seasons are shifting. Heat is building, with more extreme hot days that stress plants and workers and livestock past their limits. Rainfall is becoming less reliable and more extreme, more punishing droughts broken by more violent floods, neither of which is what steady crops want. The snowpack that stores water for the dry season in the mountains above the western farms is thinning, changing the timing of the water the whole system was built around. None of this arrives as a single catastrophic shift. It comes as a slow creep, a little hotter, a little drier, a little less predictable each decade, exactly the pace that escapes the alarm. But the cumulative effect is that the climate these regions were built for is slowly ceasing to exist, and the crops and the systems finely tuned to the old conditions are increasingly out of step with the new ones. The very envelope of weather that made these places the best farmland in the world is drifting away beneath them, one gradual degree at a time. And the fourth foundation failing is the human one. The people who actually know how to farm, and they are vanishing in the slowest motion of all. A single generation. Farming is not automatic. It runs on people, on a deep, specific, hard-won knowledge of how to work particular land, and on the communities and the labor and the family continuity that keep an operation alive. And that human foundation is quietly crumbling. The average American farmer is old, near retirement age, a generation that is held on largely out of love and stubbornness. And behind them, in enormous numbers, there is no one, their children having looked at the economics and the dry wells and the hard life and chosen other paths. Each year the farmers get a little older and a little fewer. And each retirement or death that comes with no successor quietly retires a farm and extinguishes a lifetime of irreplaceable knowledge. At the same time, the farms that remain are being swallowed into ever larger consolidated operations, and the debt and the thin margins push more of the small and mid-sized farmers out every year. This is a collapse measured in the slow turning of a single human generation. And because it moves at the speed of a lifetime, it is almost invisible while it happens. But the end state is a food system with fewer and fewer people who actually know how to grow food, and when that knowledge and that continuity are gone, they do not come back with a good year either. And running underneath all four of these foundations is a fifth pressure that speeds every one of them. The slow economic squeeze on farming itself. For decades, the prices farmers receive for their crops have not kept pace with the relentless rise in the cost of everything it takes to grow them. The land, the equipment, the fuel, the fertilizer, the deeper wells. Margins have thinned to almost nothing, so that even in good years many farms make little, and a bad year or two can end them. This economic pressure is what forces the short-sighted choices that accelerate the physical collapse. A farmer running on a razor-thin margin cannot afford to rest a field or leave water in the ground for the future, or invest in the slow work of rebuilding soil because he has to maximize this year's production simply to survive, even when he knows it is mining the foundation. The economics punish restraint and reward the very overuse that is draining the water and stripping the soil. And the same squeeze drives the relentless consolidation, the disappearance of the small and mid-sized farms into a few large operations, which hollows out the rural communities and concentrates the decisions about the land in ever fewer hands. So the money pressure does not sit beside the other four failures, it runs through all of them, turning what might have been a manageable slow decline into a forced march toward the cliff. Because the people on the land are rarely free to farm for the long term when the short term is trying to bankrupt them. Now here is what turns four slow problems into one accelerating collapse. They are all happening at once, and they feed each other. Any one of these foundations failing on its own might be survivable, something the system could adapt to given time. The danger is that they are not happening one at a time. They are happening together, in the same regions, in the same years, and they compound. The water shortage pushes farmers to pump groundwater harder, which sinks the land and concentrates the salt in the soil. The degraded soil holds less water, which makes the crops more vulnerable to the heat and the drought. The shifting climate deepens the droughts, which drains the water faster. The economic pressure and the aging workforce leave fewer people and less capacity to adapt to any of it. Each failing foundation makes the others worse, so that the total decline is faster and harder to reverse than the sum of the parts. This is why it deserves the word collapse and not merely decline. A single slow problem is a challenge. 4 interlocking slow problems, each accelerating the others, in the regions that grow the nation's food, is a system failing across all its supports at once, held up for now only by momentum and by the enormous accumulated strength of what these regions used to be. So why do the harvests still look so good if all of this is true? Why does the food keep coming? And this is the most deceptive part of the entire story. For now, the output of these regions has largely held up, and even grown, and that apparent success is used as proof that the fears are overblown. But look at what is holding the harvests up. They are being propped by ever-increasing inputs and effort, by drilling deeper wells at greater cost, by pouring on more fertilizer to compensate for dying soil, by breeding and buying crops that can tolerate the worsening conditions, by the sheer accumulated capital and skill of the most advanced farming system in history, throwing everything it has at the problem. The strength of the harvest is not evidence that the foundations are sound. It is evidence of how hard the system is working to compensate for foundations that are failing. It is a runner sprinting faster and faster to stay in the same place. And that can look like health right up until the moment the effort can no longer keep pace with the decline. The record harvest and the collapsing foundation are not contradictions. The first is masking the second. And the day the inputs can no longer compensate, the drop will not be gradual, because all the decline that was being hidden will surface at once. Because here is how a slow-motion collapse actually ends. It does not stay slow forever. A system under slow mounting stress does not decline in a smooth, gentle line all the way down. It holds and holds and holds, absorbing the pressure, looking stable, until it reaches a breaking point, and then it fails fast. The slowness is the long fuse. The collapse at the end can be sudden. For these agricultural regions, the slow decline of water and soil and climate and people is steadily weakening the whole system's ability to withstand a shock, and shocks are exactly what a shifting climate delivers more of. A severe multi-year drought, a brutal heat wave at the wrong moment, a crash in a stressed aquifer. A healthy system shrugs off a bad year. A system that has been quietly hollowed out for decades can be pushed over the edge by one, its weakened foundations giving way all at once in a way that finally, belatedly, looks like the dramatic collapse people were always waiting for. And when that happens, the response will be shock, disbelief that it came so fast, when in truth it did not come fast at all. It came in slow motion, over decades, and only the final step was quick. The slowness we mistook for safety was the disaster building the whole time. And the cruelty of that ending is that by the time it arrives, almost every option to prevent it is gone. The water that could have been conserved has already been pumped. The soil that could have been protected has already blown away. The farmers who could have changed course have already retired or gone broke. All the decades when action was still cheap and easy were the decades when the crisis was invisible and no one felt any urgency, and by the time the crisis is finally visible enough to force action, the cheap options are spent and only the impossible ones remain. That is the exact trap a slow-motion collapse sets. It hides while it can still be stopped, and reveals itself only when it no longer can. The window for a gentle fix is open precisely when no one believes there is anything to fix, and it is closed by the time everyone agrees there is. And if it seems impossible that something this slow could truly bring down something this large, History is full of exactly this. Agricultural collapses that unfolded so gradually that the people living through them never named them until their civilizations were gone. The ancient societies of Mesopotamia, the very inventors of irrigated farming, spent centuries slowly salting their own soil with the water that fed them, watching their harvests decline crop by crop across generations, until the great cities that agriculture built were undermined by agriculture's slow poisoning of the ground beneath them. Other once mighty civilizations exhausted their soils and their forests and their water over spans of decades and centuries, each generation farming a little harder on a little less, none of them experiencing a single day of collapse. All of them nonetheless collapsing. Even the Dust Bowl, which we remember as a sudden catastrophe of black blizzards, was really the fast, violent end of a slow process, decades of stripping the plains of the grass that held the soil, so that when the drought came the ground simply blew away. In every case, the pattern is the same. The undermining is slow and unremarked and tolerated, generation after generation. And then the reckoning, when it finally comes, seems to arrive from nowhere. History does not record many civilizations that noticed their slow agricultural collapse in time and stopped it. It mostly records the ones that did not, because the slowness fooled them, exactly as it is fooling us. So consider what is actually at stake, because this is not an abstraction about distant fields. These regions are the foundation of the nation's food, and much of the world's, and their slow-motion collapse is the slow-motion erosion of the single most basic thing a society provides, the ability to feed its people. As the foundations fail, the cost shows up first as higher prices and a food system leaning ever harder on imports and on other regions running down their own resources, and eventually as a genuine reduction in how much these irreplaceable places can produce. It shows up as the hollowing of rural communities, the emptying of the countryside that grew the food. And it shows up as a strategic vulnerability that a country accustomed to overflowing abundance has never had to reckon with. The slow loss of its own capacity to feed itself, spent down quietly, one imperceptible year at a time, until the reserve of strength that hid the decline is finally gone. Drive through those valleys and plains today and you will still see the abundance, the green fields and the loaded trucks and the full shelves at the end of the chain, and it is easy to conclude that the warnings are overblown, that a system this productive cannot possibly be collapsing. But the wells are deeper every year. The land is lower, the soil is thinner, the climate is drifting, the farmers are older, and there is no one behind them. Each of these moves too slowly to see, and every one of them is heading in the same direction, in the same places, at the same time, held back for now only by an all-out effort that cannot be sustained forever. This is what a collapse looks like when it happens in slow motion, across the regions that feed a nation. Not a single terrible day, but 1,000 imperceptible ones, each a little worse than the last, adding up to the quiet failure of the ground beneath the entire food system. The slowness is not mercy, and it is not safety. It is only the disguise, the thing that keeps the alarm from ringing while the foundation goes, right up until the day the slow motion finally runs out, and the collapse that was always happening simply finishes, in real time, in front of a country that could have seen it coming for 50 years and chose every single slow year to look away.